Good evening, everyone. I'm Adam Morton. I'm the Environment Editor with The Age. And as you all know, I'm here with Andrew Charlton, the former Senior Economics Advisor to Prime Minister Kevin Rudd and the author of the latest quarterly essay, Man-Made World, Choosing Between Progress and Planet. It is, I think, a fascinating and very well-researched and provocative read on several fronts. And I'm going to give you a horribly simplified version of some of its themes and then give Andrew plenty of chance to correct me. And at the end, you guys will have a chance to correct both of us and ask some questions. The essay gives a rare insight from inside the room with the leaders in the final hours of the failed Copenhagen climate conference. And it says the lesson from Copenhagen is that we need a new approach, a lesson that I'd suggest has not been taken. It says that the current approach is broken because the desire for development by the 6 billion people living in developing countries and the need to drag 2 billion people who are living on less than $2 a day out of poverty will always trump the need to spend more on expensive forms of energy to limit or reduce greenhouse gas emissions. As Andrew puts it, the world is split between those who want to save the planet and those who want to save themselves. Andrew looks at two great problems facing the planet: resource scarcity and climate change. And some of the data in the essay is quite staggering. But I think it's fair to say, and Andrew will correct me if I'm wrong, that he has some optimism that history suggests a solution, while extraordinarily difficult, is not impossible. That's probably enough from me, but before we turn to Andrew, I should introduce him properly. Andrew was, as I said, Senior Economic Advisor to Kevin Rudd between 2008 and 2010. During this time, he served as Australia's senior official to G20 summits, and was the Prime Minister's representative at the Copenhagen Climate Conference. He has worked at the London School of Economics and for the United Nations, has a doctorate in economics from Oxford University, where he was a Rhodes Scholar, and is the author of 2 books. Andrew, before we talk about the problems as set out in your essay, I thought it'd be worth starting with where you start, in Copenhagen. Can you tell us a bit about the final 24 hours inside the room with about 24 leaders, and besides learning the reason that Barack Obama's staff refer to him as Black Jesus, what you took away from it?
Sure. Thanks very much, Adam, and thanks to the Wheeler Centre for putting this on. Copenhagen was... The essay starts in Copenhagen, and Copenhagen was an extraordinary global summit by any measure. It was like no other global summit I'd ever been to or have ever been aware of. It was sort of half carnival and half summit. It was billed as the summit to save the world, and unlike most global summits where the leaders turn up and they're fairly dour events and there's the outcomes are almost unintelligible to most people, Copenhagen had an extraordinary build-up. Thousands of protesters, politicians, celebrities, gadflies and gawkers all descended on Copenhagen for those 2 weeks. And there was an enormous sense of expectations that this was going to be the summit that made a massive difference to this global problem, which had proved so elusive for so many decades. And when we arrived in Copenhagen, the sense of optimism was palpable. There were hundreds of NGOs who'd been allowed access to the summit venue, and they were staging colourful protests and demonstrations and singing songs and getting their point across in every corner of the conference venue. Out in the foyer there was a group of Catholic nuns singing climate justice songs, which were Christmas carols with the words changed to make them sound like to make them refer to climate change. But then inside the room, very quickly, a negative dynamic emerged. All of the developing country negotiators who had been, we saw each other regularly in the lead up to the summit. We had lots of meetings. We'd seen each other at G20 summits and other events. We all had a pretty clear idea of what we thought was going to happen at Copenhagen. And when we got there, it became very clear that the developing countries had a very different view. And the meeting polarised extremely rapidly into 2 camps. The developed countries, who had arrived with their legions of protesters and NGOs and the goodwill of a large part of their population, if not all their population, on one side, who wanted to get a deal done, a robust deal on climate change, and the developing countries who had a very different perspective. Their view was that while the environment is important, poverty is their chief concern. So 6 billion people on the planet come from developing countries. 2 billion of those people live on less than $2 a day. And their negotiators were not going to sign any agreement which limited their path out of poverty. And it became clear that the two primary solutions that the developing world had to climate change, one, a global agreement to put binding caps on emissions, and two, a deal to raise the cost of fossil fuels through carbon pricing, were completely unacceptable to the poor countries. And at that point, the meeting broke down, and it broke down, irrevocably.
Was it unrealistic going in to think that there could be agreement on that? Was it unrealistic to ever think that this idea, the model of a global treaty with caps on emissions and a price on carbon, could be the way forward, and a deal could be struck on that, given, the issues of development, hardly a new problem?
Yes. I think that the global machinery hadn't caught up with the changing geopolitics. So for so many decades, we lived in a world where essentially the rich countries were the main drivers of geopolitics. They drove the outcomes of the successive rounds of trade negotiations, and the developing countries were participants who came along for the ride. The largest previous global environmental challenge, as you'll recall, was the Montreal Protocol. Montreal Protocol, which was a really quite an effective global solution to the problem of the hole in the ozone layer, which came about in some decades before, and the world came together with the Montreal Protocol and delivered a solution to eliminate the chemicals which were the largest causes of the hole in the ozone layer. And that was essentially a deal done between rich countries, because it was the rich countries that were causing the problem and the rich countries who had the resources to solve it, and they were of a like mind, and the Montreal Protocol was seen as a great example, a great forerunner to what everyone thought Copenhagen was going to be. But since the Montreal Protocol and now, something has changed, and that is that the developing countries have become much more significant in the global economy. And whereas the hole in the ozone layer was a problem that the developed countries could deal with themselves, climate change is not a problem that the developed countries can deal with themselves. In fact, far from it. 9 out of the 10 fastest growing emitters are developing countries. About 80% of the growth in emissions over the next 15 years will come from developing countries. So I think to answer your question, I think the machinery of global politics hadn't caught up with the reality of the global economy, which now must incorporate the wishes of billions of poor people.
I want to turn to the scale of the problem in a moment, but just briefly, next week the Copenhagen +2, if you like, starts in Durban in South Africa, the latest round of UN negotiations. Have we reached a point where this is just pointless, or is there some merit in continuing with this process?
Well, I think we have to accept that the objective of the last 20 years, to have a binding global treaty in which all countries participate and agree to have emissions caps, is now unrealistic. And we've tried to achieve that for 20 years, and we've failed. And I think that the more sensible strategy now is to look for alternative solutions.
I just want to bear with me a moment, because I want to read out some figures that are in Andrew's essay that I think give some idea of the extraordinary scale of the challenge as he sets it out. They're from Saul Griffiths, the founder of Squid Labs and recipient of the MacArthur Genius Grant. Now, he calculated that if we're to tackle climate change effectively, it's likely we'll need to be generating 110,000 terawatt hours of clean energy in 25 years' time. And that would mean 2 terawatts of solar photovoltaic power, which would require installing 100 square metres of solar cells for every second for the next 25 years. 2 terawatts of solar thermal power, which is 50 square metres of reflective mirrors to be installed every second for 25 years. 2 terawatts of wind power, 12 wind turbines every hour for 25 years. 2 terawatts of biofuels, requiring 4 Olympic-sized swimming pools of genetically engineered algae installed every second for 25 years. 2 terawatts of geothermal power, 3 steam turbines every day for 25 years, and 3 additional terawatts of nuclear power, 3 1,000 megawatt plants built every week for 25 years. Now he calculates we would need not one of these but all of them. The basic message is current technology is completely inadequate to tackle the problem. I think most people would probably find this a little bit depressing, and yet you seem to suggest history gives us some reason for a little ray of optimism, even if the answer is not what's often described as green growth. Why?
Yeah, I mean, I think Saul Griffith and many other people have done the maths on what you need in terms of renewable energy technology to deal with the problem of climate change. And the short answer is it's much more than any politician will ever tell any public. To give you an example in the Australian context, in order to get to our 5% emissions reduction target, just our 5% emissions reduction target by 2020, if you were going to achieve that with solar power, you would need to build a large solar power station like the Moree Solar Farm, which is currently under construction, by far the largest solar farm ever constructed in Australia. That'll produce about 0.4 terawatt hours of energy per year. You would need to build one of those in Australia every week from the week that opens between then and 2020. That would get you to our 5% target. We currently, in our budget, have one. We have one of these, not 250 as would be required. So the scale of the renewable energy challenge is enormous. The figures that Adam just quoted from Saul Griffith, Saul then adds up the land space that would be required to house all of this, and he has a really cute name for this. He says this land mass that would be required to house all of this renewable energy infrastructure would be the size of a continent, and he calls that continent Renewistan. And then Renewistan becomes a metaphor for what he's trying. He says we need to achieve in order to deal with climate change. So the first message is that climate change will be an extremely difficult problem. This is not a problem that will be dealt with by a modest carbon tax and a little bit more solar and wind power. It is a problem that requires a total re-engineering of our entire global energy architecture, a problem of a massive scale. I mean, another thing Saul says, he's got a good turn of phrase, is he says, this is not like the Manhattan Project, this is not even like the Apollo moonshot, this is like the whole of World War II in the scale of engineering, cost and construction that will be required to meet this challenge over that period. So we face an extraordinary challenge, is the first thing to say, but I don't think it's a challenge that we should see as being impossible. And in the essay, I talk about a number of other challenges that humanity has faced over the last 200 years, and the mind-boggling success that we've had in overcoming those challenges. You know, in 1800, the conventional wisdom among a large part of the intelligentsia was that the world would never be able to house more than 1 billion people in anything other than total poverty. We now house 7 billion people on our planet, and they are 50 times richer than they were in 1800. So we have achieved extraordinary things through the process of compounding innovation, and I think this is a challenge that we can deal with as well if we are willing to recognise its size and take it on.
Take us through a couple of the technological developments of the last couple of hundred years that give you this faith, or if faith's the right word, this hope.
Sure. I mean, in the essay, I go through a number of different challenges that humankind has faced. A massive agricultural challenge to bring billions of people out of absolute poverty and provide sufficient nourishment for whole continents of the Earth's population. An extraordinary challenge to overcome various energy constraints that have been put in our place over the course of the last couple of hundred years. I mean, you'll know that the people have been predicting the end of oil and peak oil and for generations now, and each time we overcome that through extraordinary ingenuity. And that same ingenuity is ultimately the solution to climate change. And in the essay, I talk about this Renewable being not only extremely challenging for rich countries like Australia, but almost impossible for the poor countries. I mean, this is the real challenge, right? That's where the vast bulk of emissions growth are. And the idea of telling these poor countries that they have to rip up their existing energy infrastructure and install at huge cost new clean energy infrastructure, which as a bonus is going to mean that your power is more expensive, is completely inconceivable for those people whose populations are in poverty. One of the points I make in the essay is, in Australia we have this very successful campaign called the Earth Hour campaign, and that's sort of predicated on the idea that we need to use less energy. We need to reduce our energy use in order to deal with climate change. Well, that is a peculiar problem in a small number of countries. In the vast bulk of countries, they are desperate to access more energy and more cheaper energy. 20% of the world's population are not connected to an electricity grid. They live in darkness. Those people have a desperate desire and a right to access more energy. So in order for us to accommodate these two global challenges of enabling people to rise out of poverty and dealing with climate change, we need a new solution that doesn't mean making energy less available and more expensive. In fact, we need a solution that makes energy less expensive and more available. That's the only solution to climate change that reconciles these two problems. So that the technological challenge that I talk about in the essay is precisely that. We've spent 20 years working on a policy to solve climate change by making fossil fuels more expensive. That's failed. It hasn't worked, and it will never be acceptable to very poor people in very poor countries who need cheaper energy and a lot more of it. So the alternative solution is to find cheaper energy, to make clean energy cheaper than fossil fuels. And that is a challenge that you can partner with the developing countries in. The developing countries know that fossil fuels are already too expensive for most of their poor people. So the only solution for those poor countries is to say, we will work to develop technological solutions that makes clean energy cheaper than coal-fired power. And once we do that, you have a solution to climate change. I'm not saying it's easy. In fact, it'll be extremely difficult. But it is the only solution that reconciles these two global challenges in a way that will enable us to get progress.
The obvious question is, what does all this mean for the legislation that passed Parliament 2 weeks ago after a hell of a struggle, and in a sense was held up as Australia's part in trying to solve this problem. And the central part of that is putting a price on carbon, first with a tax, effectively, and then an emissions trading scheme.
Yeah.
What you're suggesting is that that's just the beginning, if a necessary part at all. Is it a necessary part? And I guess the second part of the question is, if you were in the Prime Minister's office now, what would you be saying needs doing?
Look, it is a good thing and it is necessary. But we have to be realistic about what a carbon price can achieve and in what countries it can achieve anything. A carbon price in some rich countries, like Australia, is a good idea. A carbon price of $20, rising up from about $20 over time, that will deliver some incremental gains in terms of our emissions. You'll probably get a little bit of energy efficiency at that price because power becomes more expensive. People use it a little bit less and substitute into other things. You might start at the margins at $20 or $30 or $40 a tonne. You might start at the margins starting to make gas a commercial alternative to coal. But just to be very clear, a carbon price in that range is so far from making renewable energy make any sense. So wind and solar power are nowhere near commercial at $20 a tonne. In fact, the IEA estimates are that you'd need between $100 and $500 a tonne as a carbon price to make wind and solar competitive with coal. So a carbon price is what it is. At a politically acceptable price, like we've implemented in Australia, it will deliver some gains. It will get us about a third of the way towards our 5% target. Let's remember that of our 5% target, we're essentially importing 2/3 of the emissions reductions we need from other countries in order to reach that 5% target, even under the proposed emissions trading scheme. So the emissions trading scheme gets us 1/3 of the way in terms of domestic abatement towards 5%. Now we need to get to 60%, and then we need to get to 80%. So those things, as Adam quoted Saul Griffith, require massive construction of a range of an entirely new energy infrastructure, and those things aren't achieved at a $20 a tonne carbon price.
I just want to pause there on the 5% target. You raised it a couple of times. You stress in the essay that it's much more difficult to reach, a much more significant target than some people think. I've seen internal federal government advice, departmental advice, suggesting that before Copenhagen, Australia should have there was enough being happening in other countries that they should be doing more than 5%. And certainly the scale of the problem you're discussing suggests that we should be doing more than 5%. Why is 5% enough? Or not enough, but why is 5% a valid target, if it is?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that 5% doesn't sound like very much. Anyone can reduce anything by 5%, right? Just knock a little bit off and there you are. But in terms of Australia's emissions, 5% is actually an extremely difficult target to achieve. I remember when Kevin Rudd announced the 5% target, and in the room there were shouts of shame and protests from some climate campaigners, and it was widely derided around Australia and indeed around the world that 5% was insufficient. Let's be very clear about what 5% means in practice. So a 5% emissions reduction target in Australia off 2000 levels by 2020. Our economy is growing at 1.6%. Our population is growing at about the same. So over the course of that period, that 20-year period, we'll actually have a business as usual if we did nothing of like 30 or 40% more than 2000 levels. So to get back to 2000 levels and go below 5%, you need about a 30 to 40% reduction in our business as usual. So 5% is already, before you've even begun, is already 30 or 40%. So that translates into changing our energy mix in Australia. So we produce, every year Australia's energy production is about 100 terawatt hours, so 300 terawatt hours, and we need to reduce that by 30%. So the simple answer, to put our 5% target in an understandable nutshell, we need to build 100 terawatt hours of clean energy power in Australia, and then we get to 5%. So what does 100 terawatt hours of clean energy power look like? Well, as I said before, in solar power terms, it looks like this. It looks like building a Moree solar farm every week from the day that the current Moree solar farm opens until 2020. 250 of them. We're budgeted for one. If you do it through wind power, it means building 5 wind turbines every single day between now and 2020. We're not building wind turbines at anything near that rate. We'd have to increase our total wind power more than 20-fold. So it is an extremely ambitious target just in terms of the construction and the infrastructure that is required to achieve it. Now, just because it's ambitious, unfortunately, doesn't mean that it's enough. We have to get to 5% and then we have to go much further. But the essence of the point of the essay is that we just don't have the technology right now to achieve this. If these things sound like a lot to you, if they sound challenging, it's because they are. They're almost inconceivably challenging. And so we need better technology in order to achieve that. And we need better technology that makes clean power cheaper than coal, so that not only can Australia do it, but the poor countries can do it as well. So that's fundamentally our objective in climate change. To get rid of these policies that are demanding that developing countries accept unpalatable caps on their emissions, that demand that countries around the world increase the price of fossil fuels, and focus on the real goal, which is making clean energy cheap.
Some European countries have tried to expand their renewable energy networks through feed-in tariffs, but this is not the sort of thing that you're talking about, as far as I can tell. So if you're sitting in the Prime Minister's office and she's saying, so this sounds great, Andrew, it's clearly a huge problem and I understand that what we've done is necessary but only a small part of the problem. How are we going to drive this technological change? And how am I, if I was advising other countries, the world's biggest countries, what should they be doing to drive this technological change? Simple question, I know.
No, it's a decidedly complex question. Well, look, I think Australia needs to accept who we are. This is a global challenge, and the solutions will come from around the world. So, number one, we're a rich country. So, sitting across the table from poor countries and saying we're not going to lead the world, we're going to wait for everyone to act and then we'll act, sounds incredibly offensive in the ears of poor countries who say, well, hold on, you guys have been industrialised for more than 100 years. You put the stuff up there, now you're asking the poor people in my country to take it out for you? It's a completely unacceptable argument that we should wait for other countries to act before we act. That's the first thing to say. Australia's a rich country. We have to take responsibility. We have to take a leadership role. But the second thing to say is that we need to be realistic about who we are. Australia is a small country as well as being a rich country. Most of the technological developments that Australia benefits from, that we apply in our homes, in our businesses, in our industries, aren't invented in Australia. We import them from overseas, right? So much the same will occur in climate change with climate change technology. Australia is really good at some elements of climate change technology and will be responsible if we put in as much effort as we should into climate change research and clean energy research. But the reality is that a lot of the big gains will come from overseas. So we need a policy which is sufficiently flexible in Australia such that we can do as much as we can now with the technology that we have, while being ready to adopt, support and cooperate with countries around the world producing the technology where most of the big gains will come from when it comes.
But are we talking about massively expanded funding for innovation? I mean, is that one of the things that is missing? I'm talking globally here as well as in Australia.
Clearly the bulk of money in climate change is going to deployment of our existing technologies, which, to quote Bill Gates, no matter how much money you put into them, will never be scalable to the size of the challenge. We need to shift focus from deployment of our existing technologies into research into new breakthrough technologies that have the capacity to deal with the challenge on a reasonable scale at an imaginable cost. So Australia needs to be part of that. We certainly need to be doing our part in the global research challenge, which will require a lot more effort and a lot more money. But we also have to accept that we're a part of that global solution. We're not the whole global solution.
I'm interested to get your take on, while we're on the road to that, the role that nuclear power can and perhaps should play. You've got an interesting quote from Griffith, going back to him in your essay, which is when he's challenged on his argument that we need nuclear power, is that I'm not trying to be pro-nuclear, I'm just pro-arithmetic. And while I was in London recently, I met up with Mark Linus, a former very vocal anti-nuclear campaigner and environmental activist turned author. His most recent book's The God Species, and he's now... argument is basically that we need to throw everything at this problem, and the time for ideological opposition to any technology, be it nuclear or clean coal or whatever you may dream of, is long past. What's your take on the nuclear issue? Obviously, that any rising sentiment that we should perhaps go that way has been nullified largely by the Fukushima disaster. But do you think that's something that Australia should be looking at? Is that part of the answer in the short to medium term?
Look, nuclear power is unquestionably part of the global solution. Australia's a slightly special case, but nuclear power is unquestionably part of the global solution. Mark Linus is a good example of why. This is a guy who's always felt very passionate about environmental issues, including climate change, including the risks of nuclear power. 20 years ago, he was chaining himself to building sites to prevent nuclear power stations being built. I think at that time, he and the Green Movement had the balance of risks right. This was an extremely dangerous technology of the array of technologies that we had available to us. now I just think the balance of risks has moved. Nuclear power is now, I think, much less dangerous than coal. And it's very difficult to see a real solution to climate change that doesn't include nuclear power. I mean, and I said Australia was a special case for the following reason. In Australia, we have a lot of land. So a renewer stand to suit Australia's energy needs, if it's conceivable in any country, is conceivable in Australia. We've got lots of sunshine, lots of wind. How is Singapore going to become carbon neutral through renewables? How is Holland going to become carbon neutral through renewables? How is England, where there's no sunshine, going to become carbon neutral through renewables? So nuclear power is unquestionably a big part of the solution. In Australia, but it's very difficult to achieve. Nuclear power stations are extremely expensive. They're certainly not brought about by low carbon taxes. They require billions of dollars to construct, a long time and lots of expertise. So in Australia's case, I think we're probably one of the countries for which nuclear power is a smaller part of the solution rather than a bigger part of the solution.
And the NIMBY argument's a very hard one to get around, I would have thought. I mean, the countries that are likely to develop nuclear are those that have already got it, I would have thought, rather than those that have not. Yeah,
but it's just on the NIMBY argument, people like wind power. To get wind power to solve the climate change problem is going to require constructing vast landscapes of wind turbines. So one nuclear power station delivers equivalent energy to 77,000 square kilometres of wind turbines. So, and you've got to construct those things. They're made out of steel and concrete, and they require huge energy and resources to construct, and then they devastate the natural landscape that they're plastered over. So, I think the balance of risks and returns between nuclear energy and renewables is shifting in renewables' favour.
And what do we do with the waste?
Well, there's no perfect solution here. I mean, I wish there was a simple answer where, I lived in the same world as Bob Brown and we could, build a few more wind turbines and put on a low carbon tax and solve the problem. But there is no simple solution. This is a very, very difficult challenge that will require us to make some very tough choices. And I think that for large parts of the world, the difficult trade-off falls down on the side of nuclear power.
I want to move on to resource scarcity because we haven't really talked about that before we go to questions. But just before I do, we touched, I think, on the issue of green growth, but not in any depth. We hear a lot about green growth these days, including from some significant politicians in this country. Is it a valid concept, or do you? I get the impression you have your doubts about its validity.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you often see people talk about the jobs bonanza that's going to come from solving climate change, as if we can kind of have our cake and eat it too. And people quote the number of jobs that are going to be created when we build new wind power and solar farms. Well, I guess the point I make in the essay is that creating jobs is not a policy end in itself. If it was, we'd just deliver the mail 8 times a day and paint Esrock purple every 3 times a week. You create lots of jobs. Just because something creates jobs doesn't mean it's a good policy idea. It's a good policy idea. Creating jobs is worthwhile if you're taking people and putting them in more productive employment. That's good for our economy. Otherwise, it's just dead waste. And
are you saying some investment in renewable programs is the equivalent to that?
Well, in fact, in the essay, I do use the analogy of Hurricane Katrina. It's like the renewable power challenge will be good for the economy in the same way that Hurricane Katrina was good for the American economy. Something comes through, devastates a massive part of the housing and capital stock, and then lots of people are employed in the process of rebuilding it. That creates activity, that creates economic activity, but the society was poorer for the experience. And there are actually a lot of parallels between that and what we're going to have to do to our energy infrastructure. Mothballing cheap coal-fired power stations and replacing them with more expensive renewable power is going to be really expensive, and people will be employed in the process of building that renewable power, but we will be poorer for the experience. So I think the way that we should approach this is not to say, is neither to focus on or pretend that there won't be costs, or that the costs will be outweighed by some illusory benefits that come along with it, nor is it to focus on the very, very real costs and say that we shouldn't do it. It's to focus on the costs of not acting. And if we focus on the costs of not acting, then suddenly the tremendous cost and effort that will be involved in dealing with this problem starts to look pretty good. And that's the real equation that we face.
Okay, let's touch on, it's a related problem obviously, but let's talk about resource scarcity, which is another chapter, the other half, if you like, of the essay, briefly. Your summary is that people used to worry about running out of oil, but many environmentalists now say we are running out of planet. And you talked a bit about agriculture earlier. In agriculture alone, you cite expert opinion that the planet will not survive the doubling of global agriculture, and that the current enthusiasm in parts of the West for organic farming perhaps worsens rather than helps the problem. So what are we facing here, and what are the potential solutions?
Yeah, climate change is clearly not the only environmental and economic challenge that we face. There are currently 7 billion people on the planet, and our population is growing extremely quickly. To give you a sense of how quickly our population is growing, consider the historical timeline. It took 10,000 years from the birth of civilization in the Fertile Crescent for there to be 1 billion people on our planet. Around 1800, there was 1 billion people. It then took about 124 years to get to 2 billion, so around the 1920s. It then took 33 years to get the next billion. It then took 14 years to get the next billion. It took 13 years to get the next billion, and now we're adding people to the planet at the rate of 1 billion every 12 years. So between now and mid-century, the global population will increase from 7 to 9.5 billion.
That's 30%.
That's 30%. That's another 30% of people on the planet, on our already stretched planet. And even more important than adding 30%, the living standards of all of us are going up at the rate of 5 and 10% a year, particularly in the developing countries. And they're consuming, people in developing countries are rightly aspiring to consume more and more, including, relevantly for agriculture, more meat and dairy. Every kilogram of meat takes about 7 kilograms of grain to produce. So as their appetites shift towards meat, they have a massive impact on our agricultural production. So by 2050, we're not just going to have to increase our food production by 30%, we're going to have to double it. And how on our already constrained planet can we double agricultural production? It sounds like an incredibly difficult challenge. In fact, some environmentalists say that this, not climate change, is the biggest challenge that humanity faces. And then if we fail to meet it, we'll end up with very significant problems of starvation around the world. And so in the essay, I look backwards to see how we've dealt with this very similar problem of a very rapidly rising global population on a constrained agricultural land in the past. And the answer is that we've achieved enormous growth in agricultural productivity. There have been predictions that we're going to run out of agricultural land and food for 2 centuries. And with the application of new technology and human innovation compounding year after year after year, we've achieved extraordinary breakthroughs in agricultural productivity. And like climate change, these technological breakthroughs are the same kind of solutions that we need to look forward to deal with the agricultural challenge. And like climate change, the rich world is focused on solutions that only work for them. So the rich world is focused on agricultural solutions like organic farming. Now, the problem with organic farming is that it does address a lot of the health and sustainability concerns associated with intensive modern farming, but it has no chance of feeding another 30%. It reduces the productivity of land. We have no chance with organic farming of feeding another 30% of people on the planet and their larger appetites. So just like in climate change, in agriculture, we need to find solutions that don't just work for the rich countries. We need solutions that work for the rich countries and the poor countries. And I argue, and I guess this is the theme of the essay, that in both cases it's technological solutions which have supported our progress in the past and technological solutions that we have to look to deal with the problems of the future.
So you see on agriculture, GM, genetically modified crops, as an inevitable part of the solution if we're going to find one?
Yeah, it's a controversial view, but I think it is. Genetically modified food offers enormous opportunities to increase yields, increase the nutrition content of grains and other foods. It has the capacity. In fact, it's one of the things that has the capacity to meet this agricultural challenge. And we need to get over the balance of risks has changed again, and we need to start looking at this and researching it very hard and adapting it in the safest way as possible. Just like the balance of risks on nuclear energy has changed. So. These technologies, I think, are the solutions going forward, and we need to recognise that the world is changing.
So what do you say to those who are concerned about the potential health effects of GM?
I mean, those concerns are very real, and we're lucky that we have people who focus on the risks. I think we would be in a much more dangerous world if we didn't have people who were alive and alert to the risks of new technologies. And in Australia, we obviously have some green groups who are very good at pointing out the risks and dangers of genetically modified food. Earlier this year, one environmental campaign group made a very public and significant protest against a genetically modified food trial in...
You can name them, I think, Greenpeace.
in the ACT. And I think it's worthwhile having people out there who are alive to these risks. But I think we also have to recognise that the agenda for rich countries in this area, in fact, in all these environmental areas, organic food, no nuclear power, renewable energy, less energy, more expensive energy, these are all solutions that don't work for the other 6 billion people we share the planet with. So, we need to get beyond solutions that just play to an audience in Australia or in the United States or in Europe and find solutions that work for the world, because these are global challenges in a way that many of the challenges we faced in the past have been much more national. And so I guess that's the approach that I take in the essay to genetically modified food.
Okay, I think it's time to go to questions from the floor. We have 2 roving microphones, so please raise your hand and we'll try and hunt you down. Perhaps we can start in the middle here. Yep.
Oh, thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to ask you, have you heard of Beyond Zero Emissions and their modelling? And you didn't seem to mention solar thermal power with storage and the fact that that kind of power is coming down in cost very rapidly. That was the first point.
Yeah.
Second point, you said fossil fuel power, if it was costing $500 per, what was it, per tonne, that would be the only way to be comparable, but it could be if all the externalities of fossil fuel were paid for by the coal and fossil fuel companies. The health costs are trillions.
Yeah.
So if they paid those externalities, then the cost of their fuel would not be cheap, and renewables would look better.
Sure.
And I think we just need to put the investment it takes, whatever it takes, like we did in the Second World War, just put it into this, because it is the same sort of problem.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with many of the points you made. There are obviously massive negative externalities associated with the use of fossil fuels, and people make arguments to have very large carbon taxes. And there's a strong argument for that in countries like Australia. But I guess the point I make in the essay, and the thing that was so apparent in Copenhagen, was we can make that argument in Australia, but it falls on deaf ears in India, where there are 300 million people who aren't connected to the grid. Their focus is on getting power, and if it comes from coal, it comes from coal. I talk in the essay about South Africa. So at the end of apartheid, South Africa had 40 million people who weren't connected to the electricity grid, and the South African government has done an extraordinary job of providing more electricity to the poor people in South Africa. And they've done that by massively rolling out coal-fired power. And just 2 years ago, they proposed the construction of the world's largest coal-fired power plant called the Medupi Power Station in South Africa. And they sought World Bank funding for that power plant. And it was enormously controversial. And all the green groups in the first world said there's no way we should be giving money to this dirty form of power. And a lot of the developed countries, when the decision was being made in the World Bank, voted against supporting the Medupi coal power plant, but all the developing countries voted for it. So it was supported. They care about the climate, but poverty comes first. So to answer that part of your question, I think that there are enormous externalities in rich countries, but when you're dealing with very poor people, the idea of raising the costs of their power is very, very difficult to implement in poor countries. So I don't think it's a solution to the global problem. To answer the other part of your question, which was remind me, sorry. Oh, right. Sorry, yes, solar thermal. Yeah.
Storage, not like that more easily.
Yeah. I mean, there've been, there have been developments in solar thermal. They've got the molten salt technology. So, there are some exciting things happening, but my view is that we have, for a long time, been told that just around the corner is the next renewable energy that's going to solve this problem and massively reduce the cost and deal with everything. We've been through wind, offshore wind, PV, geothermal, and I think the facts are that we are a long way from renewable energy that is going to be able to build Renewistan. A long way, and we need a lot of technological breakthroughs. We know what those technological breakthroughs are. It is storage, including stationary storage, as you described. It is much better batteries so that we can start to use zero emissions power to replace transport fuels. It is significant reductions in the cost of some of our core renewable energy technologies. So we have a sense for what those are, but they are a long way away. And I think there are going to be people who have a very different view in this room, but yep, yeah, no, that's not what I'm saying at all. I think that if you focus on solar and wind power, you will end up building an enormous amount of infrastructure that isn't at a scale sufficient to deal with this problem. So what we need is technological breakthroughs that deliver significant gains in the efficiency and the cost efficiency of clean energy power. And we should be working very, very hard and allocating a lot of resources to delivering those gains. And you get those technological gains in two ways. There are two kinds of technological progress. First is learning by doing. So you implement, and in the process of implementing, you get better. And as you get better, you incrementally improve the technology and efficiency of these renewable energy sources. And the second is to go for technological breakthroughs through basic research and development. We need to be focusing on both of those things. So this is a long way from an argument that we should sit back and wait. Of course we shouldn't. This is a terrible problem that we need to work very hard and put enormous resources into solving. But my fear is that if we don't understand the scale of the challenge, we'll end up pouring resources into technologies that are available today which cannot be scalable to the size of the challenge that we face. And that would be an error.
Okay. Yep, down here. Woman in black.
Hi. My question is, we obviously need global leadership on these matters that we've been discussing tonight, and we need politicians who are willing to rationally weigh up risks and lead populations through the hard choices that you've been talking about. We currently have a Western world, at least, that's full of politicians who are concerned more with appeasing the markets as they go through their churns since the GFC, and with winning swinging votes, particularly as we're finding in Australia. So I wanted to hear from you about what suggestions you might have for how we can improve our political leadership to to help deliver some of these solutions?
Andrew, can I add to that? Are politicians being honest with us about the scale of the problem?
Look, I think Australia is a case of hope. We have a hung parliament in Australia, a political situation that was described last year as one that was going to deliver gridlock in Australia, and instead we now have an emissions trading scheme. We have one of the most comprehensive emissions trading schemes in the world. An extremely bold reform. I've made some comments tonight about that. I think that's only part of the solution, but nothing takes away from the fact that it was an extraordinarily difficult achievement for any government around the world, let alone a minority government facing very significant opposition from a determined conservative opponent. So, I think Australia is a case in point of where, if you try and deliver real leadership, you can be successful, and it is what it is. We need a lot more, but I think I think it really is something that the rest of the world is watching very closely to see how it pans out.
Okay. Yep.
Thank you. I'd be quite interested to hear your view on the role that China played in Copenhagen, because that's been alluded to, but I've never quite understood. Yeah. So what's your take on that, please?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a great question because I think that China's energy policies are widely misunderstood around the world. On the one hand, we seem to hear that China blocked Copenhagen, they don't care about climate change, they're only focused on their own development. And on the other hand, you hear that they're building enormous amounts of renewable energy and they're doing all these incredible things with technology and solar power. So I think China is such a big part of the problem and the solution, but their objectives are really poorly understood. Let me tell you what I think China's energy objectives are. Number one, development. So they have some 300 million people who are in extreme poverty, and their primary objective is to provide those people with power and development. However, China doesn't have a lot of fossil fuel resources, and they're very concerned about their ability to provide power to their population, particularly in the event of a problem. They're very concerned about what they call their energy security. Now, renewable energy is something that they can create on their own, within their own country. It's not fossil fuels they have to import a lot of, but renewable energy is something that they can produce within China. So the benefit for China one of the benefits for China of renewable energy is it provides them with energy security. That's got nothing to do with climate change, but it provides the Chinese with some confidence that they can produce energy domestically. The third concern they have is about air quality. They have tremendous problems with air quality, which is creating very immediate and significant effects on their population, particularly in large cities. And coal is extremely dirty, not just because of its effect on the climate, as you know, but also its effect on the day-to-day health of people in cities. So, and then fourth, I think they are concerned about climate change. But that's the order of their priorities, in my view. And that explains why simultaneously they seem to be doing all this work on renewable energy, but not too keen to sign up to big global agreements that constrain their path towards development. And my view of how we should deal with China is an essential part of this story. If China doesn't come on board with a solution to climate change, it's almost impossible to conceive of a global solution. They are so big and they're industrialising so quickly. So my view is that we should support China's objectives. If their objective is energy security, not parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere, good for them. Let's partner with them to develop these new technologies and implement them for whatever reason they want to implement them. So I think as you point out, the Chinese part of the solution is really complex but really important.
Time for a couple more. We probably should take one from the back.
I must congratulate you on being the essence of diplomacy here, having a bet both ways with almost everything I've listened to. And you're certainly very eloquent. However, there are a couple of points, and there were many, but I'll just raise a couple on that. One is GM. You mentioned that the risk and the measuring of the risk. Well, I know of no crop in the world after the first year of seeding it that actually produces a superior crop to organic crops. That's number one to begin with. And it's only Monsanto and its control of the White House and the control of the world that allows them to persuade and push political leaders to doing what you described earlier on in Canberra. Second point, zero emissions have carefully researched all of these, of the possibilities, and I think from memory something like 45 billion a year over the next 10 years would completely replace all the power stations. Now, this year, over the next 4 weeks, $35 billion will be spent on Christmas presents alone. Just imagine that. I mean, it's not going to be a big dislocation. If you think it's that large a dislocation, that big a problem, unless zero emissions have their figures wrong, and I don't think they do, it means if we foregone all of our Christmas presents, we would, for the next 10 years, we'd have the problem licked. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks. There are two separate points there. One on climate change and one on genetically modified food. I have a different view to you on both. You won't be surprised to hear. I think that if you take it away from talking about some study that talks, the Greens in Australia talk about having fully renewable power in Australia within 10 years. Instead of debating that in abstract, let's talk about what that means physically. Let's talk about the property and construction and engineering that would be required to deliver that. There are a lot of costings out there. Some of them are very small costs. Some of them are very large. I think that the lower end of the scale is, in fact, it's obvious from the scale of what we're talking about, right? The Moree solar farm. Let's talk about this, right? The Moree solar farm, the largest solar farm ever constructed in Australia by a multiple, right? That Moree solar farm will be operational in 2015. 2015. When it is fully operational, these are all publicly available statistics, not produced by any group from either side. When it is fully operational, it will produce 0.4 terawatt hours of clean energy into the Australian grid. Australia's annual energy production is 300 terawatt hours every year. So you just have to do the math to think about how many Moree solar farms you're going to need to get from 0.4 to 300. And what I'm saying to you is that any study that tells you that that cost is moderate or simple or achievable in the short term simply hasn't looked at the engineering.
And on GM?
Thanks.
Perhaps to finish.
Yeah. Thanks, Adam. Thanks for reminding me. Again, on GM, I guess I have a different view. Hundreds of millions of people have consumed GM products one way or the other, and there are no this is the World Health Organization, I quote them in the essay, there are no reported health effects from those people. And my favourite story about GM, and this is not in the essay, it's in a book by Stuart Brand, is he talks about when Monsanto was doing trials in India. And there was a lot of controversy, and a number of opponents of GM crops ended up tying up Monsanto's trials in red tape, and it was very slow to get off the ground. But the poor, small Indian farmers were so desperate to get much higher yielding and much more nutritious GM crops that they ended up stealing the GM crops. And for nearly a decade, there was more fake GM crops in India than there were real authorised GM crops, because these things offer the capacity to produce vastly more food with less pesticides on more land. Now, that doesn't mean that there are no risks, and I accept that there are a lot of people out there pointing out those risks, and I'm glad that we have those people out there to do that. But what I'm saying is that the world's population is going to increase by 30% between now and 2050. the amount of food we're going to need to produce is going to double between now and 2050, and we need solutions that have a realistic chance of meeting that challenge. And unfortunately, I think that despite the risks that I'm glad people point out, that GM is part of that solution. It's certainly not all the solution. There are lots of other potential solutions out there. Reducing waste, improving warehousing, improving transport efficiency, all of those are going to be very important. But I think we shouldn't be ruling out solutions to the agricultural challenge, the resource challenge, the climate challenge, until we've really understood the scale of the challenge and the balance of risks between the different choices that we face. There are no great choices out there on any of these things. So we need to find solutions that balance the risks.
Okay, I'm sure we could keep going all night, but unfortunately we're now ticked past 7:15, so we'll have to rule a line there. I'd like to thank you all for coming and for engaging in the debate afterwards. And obviously I'd like to thank Andrew for coming and telling us about his essay. I'd recommend it to you, and Andrew is going to be available after we finish to sign copies of his essay, which you can buy at the back of the room, I understand.
And can I thank Black Ink very much for your for publishing the essay and for tremendous editorial support, which has been really great. Thanks to Adam and thanks to the Wheeler Centre, and thanks for coming.
Thanks everyone.